Hi class, this is your instructor Megan, and I just want to kind of give you an example of the way of thinking about using columns. So I'm going to design this page for the Volunteer Voice at the Children's Museum, and I want you to kind of see how I'm doing it. Some of you guys had questions in the meetings this week about how to use columns, how do you decide what to do with the page, and so I thought maybe I'd just walk you through putting a page together so you can sort of see my thought process on it. So this is a page, and we've got two articles that need to go here. We've got this piece about an intern, and then we've got an announcements section. So what I need to do is kind of figure out, what am I going to do? What columns do I have to work with? This design already uses a certain number of columns just because I created this template a long time ago and I decided on the columns back then. You're going to have to decide columns for yourself, and you have to use columns. If you don't, it's going to be pretty obvious that you haven't used them. To create columns, you're going to go to Layout, Margins, and Columns, and you're going to select the number of columns that you want to use. 2 is not enough. If you want to do 2, I suggest doing 4 instead. 3, you can do 3, it's not going to give you a lot of variety. For this design we use 5, and I want to show you kind of why having more columns is helpful, because I think it's the way of thinking about it when you first design is like, hey, columns are hard, I'm going to use the least amount possible. That's what I used to do, at least. But really, the more you have, the easier it is to design because the more options you have. So I have this story about an intern spotlight, and I have announcements. I really have 2 options. I can put announcements horizontally across the page, or I can put it vertically across the page. So let's put it vertically. If I take the announcements and I kind of decide to put them maybe in these 2 columns over here, and then I'm going to use 3 columns for the intern story. Now, why am I giving this 3? Well, announcements aren't as important and there aren't as many of them. So I don't want them to be dominant. I don't want them to have the most amount of space. So I'm going to give them just 2 columns, and I'm going to give the intern story 3, so it'll be bigger because it has more columns. And then I can start to put my announcements here. Now my announcements are highlighted in this sort of salmon color because this computer doesn't have the font that I'm using, but I'm just going to ignore it because I don't really care, and I don't really design on this computer typically, so I'm not going to bother getting the font. So I can take my announcements and I can strip them down the side here. Okay, so I have announcements, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to line them up on the left and right. So this entire column of text lines up with the columns here on the left and here on the right. So announcements needs to do the same thing. Well, with this little box here, I can't fit it. So I'm going to have to put announcements here. And I want this to touch on the left and right. And it does. So that looks good. So I've got my announcements. Okay, announcements are in. And then I'm going to take my story about the intern and place that in the 3 columns over here. So I've got intern spotlight, Andrew, and then I've got my story, and I'm going to put my story in, and I'm going to make it take up all 3 columns. It needs to touch on the left and right, but this page looks very boring. I would not want to read this page. It is full of text. I don't care about reading that much text. So what I want to do is make this a little less difficult to read, a little more inviting. So I'm going to take this piece here, and I'm going to turn it into 2 columns of type. I don't want to do 3. Even though 3 lines up with the columns, it's too skinny. Look what it's like to read this. Be a high school English teacher and was deciding whether or not to. It's very hard to read just a few words at a time. So I'm not going to do 3, I'm going to do 2. And you might think to yourself, hey, you're not using the columns, but really I am, because this entire module of headline, subhead, article lines up on the left and right with the columns. Within that module, I can ignore the columns. So I've got 2. That looks a little bit better. It looks a little bit easier to read, but I've got a nice picture. With modules, the picture typically goes at the top, so I'm going to take my picture of Andrew, nicest guy ever, and put him here at the top. And again, I'm going to line this picture up with the left and right of the columns. So now I've created a nice little module. I've got everything lined up on the left, I've got everything lined up on the right, and I've even got the picture lined up with the top margin here. So this looks a little better, right? This looks way less boring to read. This is definitely doable. It's still pretty text heavy. So I also have a little pull quote. I can bring my little pull quote in here and line that up so that it lines up on the right with everything else. But what you'll notice is I'm actually going to line it up not with the purple column guides, but with my sort of new column guides, which have been made by this text. So again, in this module, I'm kind of ignoring the purple column guides. My entire module does line up with the purple guides, so within this module, I can kind of do my own thing, which is to create this new alignment. So now I've got my pull quote in there, and that looks even easier to read. It's less text heavy, a little more exciting. Now I even have a little fact box I can throw in here that I created. So if I want to have like a little rundown of Andrew's favorite things, now I have a fact box, and that takes up the right column. This is beginning to look really, really easy to read, and like it's not going to take very long to read. Now, of course, the story got shortened, so I can jump this to another page. I'm actually going to leave the fact box out because I think it actually looks pretty good with, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to put the fact box on the bottom. Let's do this. Span it across the module. There we go. That seems better. Let me get that line moved. Oops, come here, line. Okay, I'm going to line that up. I'm going to turn my guides on, line everything up with the columns. There we go. So this is already looking kind of easier and more fun to read. Now, I'd have to put another announcement in here in order to make this take up the right amount of space. I don't want it to just be empty. I want this whole page to have something in it. So I need everything to kind of line up across the bottom here. So voila, announcements, there we go. That's my page. Using the column guides and using some elements to make it a little more exciting. Now, I could make Andrew's piece even larger by taking the announcements and, I'm going to have to make that pretty small, making them a lot smaller. I can make them maybe one column, and then I can give Andrew more space. So I have lots of options here as far as where I put these on the page, but you'll notice I'm still lining everything up. It's not the greatest crop on that picture. I'm gonna move this whole thing down a little bit. Maybe get rid of that back box so that Andrew's face doesn't get cut off so much. There we go. Now I am missing a caption. That is kind of an issue. There we go. Now this is weird here. There's some white space. So I'm going to make all of this a little smaller until that white space goes away. There we go. And now I have room for a caption. So I can put a little caption in here to explain. I actually think this looks better than the first one that I made because the picture is much more dominant. The announcements really aren't that important. I mean, they're interesting, it's good to know, but they're not that important. This design says to me that what I'm really supposed to do is read about the intern, and then I can read the announcements if I'm interested. This design, let me go back in time, has much less dominance. There's still a lot of overwhelming text on this page. It's not exactly clear what's important here, whether it's the announcements or the intern. So just taking my modules and changing them a little bit gives me much more dominance and makes the page a lot more visually interesting. It seems like this page has a lot more going on now in terms of interesting things I would want to read. And I've got room for the caption. So just a little example of using columns and how you might think about modules and how you can correct a design if you don't feel it's working. So I didn't feel like the first design was working. I felt like the intern story didn't seem that important. The announcements were way too big. So we're just changing the size of the modules so that we have much more dominance.